everybody and start out.
Today is May 15th, 1991, and my name is Ellen Szakal, an interviewer with the Holocaust Oral History Project of San Francisco. Today we are interviewing Ursula Sabel, and assisting in the interview is Judith Heim. Ursula, would you begin by stating your current name, your former name, your maiden name, your date of birth, and your place of birth?
Okay. My name is Ursula Sabel, and my former name was Ursula Bodenheimer. I was born August 11th, 1930 in Germany, in Karlsruhe.
And I guess you can begin by telling us about your family.
I don't hear.
Who was in your family, or your family members?
Oh, my family members, at the present, my family members was my sister, my two sisters, myself, my mother, my father. And then after I was married, I had three daughters. Those three daughters, so that sort of covers the family circle, yeah.
And what was your childhood like? Describe your childhood.
When was my last?
Describe your childhood. Describe your childhood.
Oh,
what was your childhood like?
My childhood, okay. My childhood in Germany was rather carefree from what I remember, early childhood. I did have some problems. I had some physical problems, and I was in hospital for a while. But otherwise, I had, a very fair childhood until about 3-4 years later, when I was about 4 or 5 years old. Things were getting more difficult in Germany. My parents were not able to participate in all the things in the government and in business, and they were having problems, having those problems, and that sort of reflected in our home life. That there were. We saw that there were some problems. Now, my uncle was living in Brazil, and they were thinking at some time, in that early part, when I was about 5 or 6 years old, they would like to migrate possibly to Brazil. And they made some contact with the Brazilian government, and through my uncle, my parents, they had the system where you had to pay money to get this through Brazil. You couldn't do it legitimately. You had to pay somebody to get interested and stuff like that. So they took a big sum of money and they paid this man. And what happened was he disappeared. And so there was the money that was going to go towards our immigration, and so that didn't work out very well. So the next course was the slow process of trying to get into the United States. It seemed, in all this was, while this was happening, the small town of Rutesheim, where I was living in, it seemed to be that the town, there were more and more people coming into the town, because this was the beginning of the Nazi period where there was a build-up. They were building up the area, the rural area, so that they were building factories and things, and streets were not safe anymore. You couldn't run around the streets or run around like you used to do that. And my first indication of something happening was when I was 6 years old. I believe I was six years old. I had a little friend, and he was run over by a Nazi truck, because what happened was they had this ongoing traffic that wouldn't stop. They wouldn't care who was walking around. They would just just quickly, run people over. And this was a 7 or 8-year-old boy, and he was killed. And it was a terrible tragedy in our Jewish community because he was the son, the only son of parents and didn't have any other children. And right then and there, besides what was to come, it ruined those people's lives. The townspeople themselves were still very nice and very amiable. I had children to play with. There were non-Jewish children that I played with, and they were not letting it bother them what was going on in the rest of the country. We were still an integrated community and fairly happy in that respect. Except no one was happy with what was going on, that the Nazi that were coming into town. They were coming into, build up and start building homes and stuff like that. And so that made it rather difficult, very difficult. By the time I was 7, I believe, I think I was 7, I had to start school. And I went to the regular school, and unfortunately, I had a Nazi teacher. And she was terrible. I was terrible. I was just continually ostracized, and she was always making remarks, and she was making me very uncomfortable. And I certainly did not enjoy my school life. That was the only school life I had. That was my first grade in school. And there was no Jewish school in town. The Jewish inhabitants, there were about 700 Jewish families, but we did not have a Jewish school, so the children had to go to other schools. My older sister was working out of town, and my middle sister was going to school. She was taking the train to neighboring schools in neighboring, and she was also having a lot of difficulty on the train with being Jewish and stuff like that, and their people was yelling, and it was very difficult, for them. Now, during that period, I don't remember what I said, but people say from my town, claim that I said something that my father said, that all the Jews, all the Nazis should be hung, or something to that effect. Anyhow, I don't know whether I said it or whether it was just something that they tried to do. Anyhow, my parents had to get me out of town, and I went to live for a period of about a few months with my grandparents in Edenkoben. And that was a town. Edenkoben was also a town where the Jews were still didn't have any problems there. They were still going on with their trades and doing everything, and there was no, it didn't seem to affect them, very much. But it wasn't until close to the Kristallnacht during that time where things got worse, where people in our town were told by Nazi officials that they were not to communicate with us, that they were threatened, that if they communicated with us, that things would be bad for them, and a lot of that happened. But there were many people in the town who didn't heed that, and they still communicated. The two children that I played with, their names were Marion and Gertrude. I remember the same as my sister's names. I played with them till the very end, until we left, till we left Germany. In the meantime, my parents were having great difficulty in they'd wanted to migrate, and they were trying to get us to the United States. They went all over to all the consulates, the American consulates, trying to get out of the country, trying to find out, what the proceeds were. At the time, there was there were only a certain amount of Jews that were allowed to come into the United States. There was so that it was very careful, and if you came in, you had to have a backup of people here who would say that in case of some problem, that they would take care of you. Well, as it happens, my father who was in First World War One, fought for the Germans, had only one eye, had shrapnel wounds on his arm, and he had some wounds on his heart. And so naturally, the German government was not about to take somebody like that into the country without getting a very, very extensive visa. And even though we had relatives here in this country, they were immigrants themselves, and they didn't have that kind of money, what that required. And my father's cousin, I have her picture in here. She, want me to take it out? No. My father's cousin, who they had a store and a bakery, and they were looking to see where they could get some other people to let's see if I can find it. It's too bad that I didn't get it. I had the pictures in my hand and now I can't find them. She didn't know what to do. She asked people, different people that she knew, different relatives who had money, and no one had enough, felt that they had enough money to, so I just can't get it together. Here it is, okay. Anyhow, she opened up the telephone book and she decided that she was going to take a chance. And my name was Bodenheimer, and so she saw it in the telephone book. There was a Dr. Bodenheimer, and she thought, well, possibly he was a relative, but she didn't know him, and so she called him up and said, look, here's your chance to get these people into the United States. You never have to do anything with them. You don't have to, you don't, here, that's her, that's her right here. So, yes, that's right.
Why don't you hold it up for the camera?
Yeah, here, this is what her, okay.
You've got to back it away, Judy.
And she called him and told him this story and explained to him what the situation is. And he was a very wealthy man and a very well-known doctor. And he said yes, that he would do it, that he would write this letter, but he never wanted to see us, and he never wanted to have anything to do with us, but he would do that. He would, and it actually saved our lives by doing that, you see, because through that, getting that letter and getting that support, we were able to get our visas for the United States.
Where did he live?
That was in 1938.
Where did he live?
Where?
Did he live? Where did he come from? Dr. Bodenheimer.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know where he comes. He was in the United States, and I don't know. Well, possibly that there may have been some link somewhere, but we never knew. We never knew that. We never knew what that was. After having that, that was a step forward. But at that point, just at that point, that was the Kristallnacht. I think it was Kristallnacht, or that was the very bad time in Germany. And my parents had just been coming home from Karlsruhe. They were trying to make arrangements and for our leaving and make all these arrangements. And as they were coming out of the station, someone came over. This police came over and wanted to arrest my father. So my mother said, "See, this I just found out yesterday by hearing the tapes, because." There's another incident, but I didn't know about this incident. As they got off the train, they wanted to arrest my father, and my mother said, no, you cannot arrest this man. He fought for Germany, he fought for you, he lost his eye, he did all that for you. And these were the police, the Rutesheim police, not the Nazis. And he says, you can't do this, And besides, she says, we are going to migrate, and we're not ever going to come back, so you don't have to worry about what's going to happen. So, they let him go. They actually let him go, and they came home to my sisters and myself. We were waiting for them at that home, and that was the day we were. I think we knew things were happening. We had radio on, and Hitler was making all these comments about the Jews. I think that was the time, the beginning of the Kristallnacht, where the Jew was supposed to have killed this Nazi, and that was all on, all this hatred was all on the radio. I remember vaguely, what was going on, the feeling. I remember the feeling. And the interesting thing is, that night, I remember our menu. We had cauliflower and potatoes and meat, something like that. And then about 2-3 hours later, there's a knock on the door, and the Nazi police, this time, have come to arrest my father. That was that night. And it wasn't late. It was just right after supper, which was maybe 7 o'clock or something like that. And had to take some provisions with him, and that was it. And then they took my father, and I remember as a child, I remember getting very, very nervous. And I even remember I had this doll that I called Renata. I remember that doll. I remember I migrated with that little doll. I would, hug this little doll and everything. And an hour or two later, we were notified that everybody in our town had to leave town immediately, that we were given something like 2 hours to leave. And then in the evening, we had to pack up and just take everything, and I don't remember too much about the packing. I know that I just took my doll, but I do remember that in the tape where my mother was telling the story, that she said that we packed all the wrong things. We didn't have any underwear. We didn't have anything. We really didn't have the right things altogether. But me as a child, I didn't realize that, of course. And I just realized I had my doll and I had my whatever I had on, and that was okay, for me. And as we were leaving, my mother said, I'm going to go and get your father out. Well, my sisters were upset. How could you do this, Mother? We'll never see you again. Don't do that. Please don't go. No. She was determined that she was going to go to the prison and she was going to get him out, and she was not going to leave without him. Okay. So in the meantime, she had told us, my older sister was about 17 at the time, to walk us to the the railroad station, and that's all right. And so I have pictures here, and I went back in 1988, and I tell you, I've never forgotten that railroad station ever. It's something that's been in my mind and so the first thing I did when I got back to Rutesheim was take a picture of the railroad station. And here. It's got
to be held there. It's got to be held
okay.
in front of her.
And the railroad, and it really hasn't changed. This was a picture in 1988. It's still the same. Still the same. Yeah. Okay. And we were sitting at the, on a bench on the railroad station. And by the way, there were some non-Jewish friends who had heard what was going on. And despite the fact that they weren't supposed to get together with us, or they weren't supposed to do all that, they came. They knew what was happening, and they came with us three. They sat with us. There was 3-4 people, non-Jewish people, who came with us to sit with us at the railroad station, because they were afraid that both parents might not come and that we would be just us, see. So what happened was, well, we waited and waited, and in the meantime, my mother tells the story very well. She said she went in there, she talked to the head man, who was not a Nazi, who was in charge, who was the police for Rutesheim, and she said to him, you can't take him, for the same thing she told him before. And so he said, after all, for all that he's done for you, you have no right to do it, and she was very vehement about it. And she said something that she says in the tape, which really floored me, and I hadn't thought about either. She said to them, "We have our visa, we can leave." And that was a terrible thing to say. See, she didn't realize it at the time, but when she was telling the story to my nephew, she said, if they had been smart and realized what I'd said, they could have taken our visa away, But as it happened, we were lucky. We're just lucky that they didn't take it away. And he sent two SS men on one side of her, and they went into the little prison, which usually housed only people, drunks, and, the small town prison. And she says in that thing, that's a very heartbreaking thing in that tape that really got me. She says if she could paint or if she could draw, and all her life she'll always remember the picture. Here they were about 30 Jewish men sitting, in the prison and waiting, didn't know what was going on, and waiting what was going to be. Many of them probably never came out alive anyway, because many of them were transferred to concentration camp and were died. Anyhow, she did get my father out. They did let my father leave, and we had to leave the area immediately, And so when the three of us saw our parents coming, I mean, that was just really fantastic, because we really hadn't thought that we would ever see them again. It was just a terrible experience, A good deal of it. I was quite in shock during that period, and one of the reasons I've been told has been why I don't hear well. That's a connection with that, because it really, affected me. Well, after that, we came to, we went to Mannheim. That was the only place, because the Jews in certain areas had to leave those areas and go to other areas. And what they kept doing that again and again, and then picking people up all the time, always trying to pick people up. Well, we got to Mannheim and we went to relatives, and it was a very bad sight. Our relatives were very much affected and very upset, and my parents were trying to make the connections to buy the tickets to leave the country. Well, as it turned out, because of the situation, the price was so high that it was almost impossible to get the money. But luck would have it, my father had just sold his car the day before, because all the money in the banks was frozen. If you had money in your bank, that wasn't your money anymore, because they kept your money, and you could only take what you had with you. And my father happened to have in his pocket, which by the way, in prison they hadn't yet taken his things away. He had in his pocket where he had sold his car the day before. So we had enough money to send one person to buy one ticket. And it was very, very important to buy the ticket for my father, because the men were picked off the street. Whenever there was a man and they realized it was Jewish, they don't care if he walked down the street, they picked him up, and that was it, see. So, with my father didn't want that, but my mother insisted, and then they bought that one ticket for my father. And it was terrible when my father left. Imagine, he leaving us. He didn't like that at all. He didn't want to leave, but there was no way. I mean, we still had a chance. The women and children still had somewhat of a chance to live, but the men didn't have any. So he left. It was actually a week before we left, but we didn't know that. See, we didn't know if we'd get out. So, and then my mother tried to get money, and she went everywhere. And wherever she went, they saw that people were being picked up and people were being put in prison. And so that all those Jewish organizations in the town, so she stopped going to them. And she finally found, somebody got her in touch with a money lender. Somebody was able to loan her the money in Germany, and which she would have to repay in the United States. And that worked out. And so she loaned the money for us to buy. She had to buy 4 tickets to get enough money for us to get tickets. And we were staying in this cousin's or relative's house. One of the people there was one was Jew and one was a non-Jew. I mean, they were two, but they had a son who was mentally disturbed, and the Nazis picked him up and gassed him. You see, that happened while we were in there. So every time, that's what I got this shock. Every time the bell rang, I remember it had this long hall. And every time the bell rang, I was like, I shook, because we didn't know, is this going to be the end, or is it's going to be all right? Is it somebody friendly, something like that? And my mother didn't have any money at all. We had no clothing because we had bought the wrong clothing. She went and bought 3 pairs of slippers, she says, which was kind of ridiculous because we needed so many other things. And she didn't buy herself a pair of slippers, but we didn't have slippers, And finally, we did get to Hamburg, and we did get on the ship. Once we were on the ship, the Nazis started coming in the ship and trying to take people off the ship and put them. So we hid all the way under the ship in the bathrooms, and during the whole time until the ship finally embarked, And this ship was an American ship called the President Roosevelt, and I remember that very, very distinctly. Now the trip over, 90% of the people on the boat were sick. And my mother was sick, seasick, and they were probably, all this happened. My sister was 13, was having a good time. She had boyfriends. She was running. My mother had no control. We were just running around. I being only 8 years old, I enjoyed my trip because, first of all, I wasn't sick. Second of all, I had all the food I ever wanted in the world because everybody was sick, and I would walk around and see all these beautiful, the apples and all these beautiful food that I had, I could pick up anything. And then every night I went to the movies, and what did I see? Blondie. And then I'll never forget this calling, Blondie, that I'll never forget that as long as I live. That was the only English word, American word that I understood, And I explained it to my mother, who was sick, and she said, she told me at one time, she came with me, and she heard it for the first time, and she mentions that in her tape, that seeing this Blondie. Also, they had, it was in November, and it was Thanksgiving, and we had no idea. Turkeys. We had never in our life had turkey or anything like that. And so this was an American ship, and during Thanksgiving they were serving turkey, and we ordered goose, And so that the man who served us explained to us, you don't do that at Thanksgiving, you eat turkey, And also when they played the national anthem, to be able to stand up, we had no idea they would take us and say, this is the national anthem of this country. You're supposed to stand up, I mean, if you're an immigrant, you don't know any of these things if you come into the country, and something like that. So it was a very funny experience. It was really a funny experience. But my sisters had a fairly good time, and we went out, except my mother thought she would die because she was really feeling so bad. But afterwards, we were all reconciled when we came to the United States with my father, which was, really, really great. But we didn't come with anything. I mean, we had, I explained some of the situation. We had a lift. We had a lift that was packed, but we weren't there to pack when it was packed. And there were other people who just threw anything into it and took out what they wanted. So later on, when the so-called lift came, there were things, there were some things, but there were others that were missing. There were beds were missing, or there were some dishes and some, not dishes. And so we had sort of a 30-40% of what we had originally planned to leave the country with. And we didn't have any money. They were only allowed a certain amount of money that everybody was allowed to, take in. And we moved in at first with our relatives, and very, very poor relatives. My mother's sister, who lived on First or Second Avenue in New York City with the train over the, and I wasn't really used to city life at all. It was very, 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 very bad. Now, the situation there was very difficult. My aunt was an epileptic, and she'd have these epileptic fits. And there were times when everybody was gone, and I was with her. I remember one particular time where she had one of those fits, and here I was a 9-year-old, and I didn't really know what was going on. She would just pass out, or she would, and so my parents really made a great effort to move to another area, and they moved up to what is now called, what then called was Washington Heights, Manhattan. And we had, the three of us lived in one room. It's with three girls. We were three girls, and my parents lived in the living room, and we had, and there were no, it was the end of the jobs were very hard to come by for men. And it was the Depression was just like the end of the Depression in this country. And my father could not get any jobs, but my mother immediately went to work. And she did something she never in her life did before, because she's never, she was cleaning houses, and she worked in restaurants and things like, just to get going. And my father was sort of taking care of me, to see that I get to school. And he was sort of, we reversed the roles, for a while, until a little bit later when my father got a job as an elevator operator. And even then, I would go where his job was, and I would very often, I would spend a lot of time with him. And my sister, my middle sister, Marion, who was 13, 14 at the time, was sort of like a mother surrogate to me. She took me, helped me out and everything, even though she herself was having, was as a teenager, was having a difficult time, she had lots of boyfriends and worked and all that. And my older sister went to work immediately for relatives, and they were really not very nice to her. They almost treated her like a slave. I mean, she worked like 12 hours and worked in a bakery and never had time off. For a 18-year-old girl, she didn't really have much time to do, for herself at all. She just worked all the time. But everybody contributed to the family so that we could, live better. So with all that, we were able to move into a little better apartment and have a little better life, But my sisters always worked, and during all this time, my life was I was going to school. But coming back to the schooling, since I missed a lot of time, I did not get a chance to go to school in Germany. I only went to first grade. I did not have any expertise in the language, so I was really put back quite a bit when I came. They put me in, I should have been maybe in third grade, maybe they put me in first or second grade, and I never really fully enjoyed my early school life at all, because I was not in the right situation. I wasn't with the right group, the right age group. And then later on, when I finally did get up there, I still was not satisfied. I never did enjoy the day school. So later on, by the time I got up to high school, I switched to evening high school, because I didn't make friends in day high school, and it just wasn't my it just didn't seem to my thing. And so I worked during the day. I worked in a nursery school, as a nursery school assistant, and I also worked with the head of the nursery school had a child who was very, very mentally ill, and I worked with her and that child. So I had two jobs, and I went to school in the evening, and that's when I opened my social life, and my life started then. So I'm doing all these different things. Then I would go to night school. Then my social life would start about 9 o'clock in the evening. And I did that, for several years. And it was very, very fruitful. And I met a lot of wonderful people, and I had a lot of friends. And it worked out for me. But by doing this, my schooling was always messed up. I didn't graduate the same other people graduate, but in the long run, I did graduate college, and I did go through that, but it took a lot longer, and I had my experiences were before my education. It just reversed what some people, have done, and but it worked out. It worked out okay, and I had a lot of support. My parents were very supportive, and my sisters were very supportive, and I had, my family we were a fairly close family. So, does somebody else want to say something?
What did your father do? What was his occupation in Germany? What did your father do?
Okay, now my father was, he had two different things. Before the 19, when the stock market broke, before the stock market, we had a cigar factory, and we manufactured cigars, and he was head of that factory, and he also went around the area and sold the cigars to people, to other areas and stuff like that. And at the same time, my mother was also always working. We had a clothing store. And it was we had a big place. We rented out some places where people lived. When we had it was quite a big house, and we had a very big garden we had a gardener, I remember, which with all kinds of fruits and vegetables, and things like that. And then after there was difficulty with the cigars. The cigar factory closed, but my father was still involved with cigars and with the making of cigars, and he was sort of like a salesman. He would go to the neighboring counties and the cities and sell cigars from that area, and it was well known all over that. At the same time, he was also selling clothing, because we had a clothing store, so it was sort of a combination of different things. See, my grandparents had a clothing store in Edenkopen also, so my mother had all that background, and so that's what they were doing in those years, they were always working. Both my parents were always was always involved in some, And at one time, I guess years before that, they were probably a lot more wealthy. When my father's my father's father and his relative. So when I was in Germany, I went to the I went to find out where all these different. I never met my grandfather on both my father's side. I only met my grandfather on my mother's side, and so I got all this mixed up. I want to show you the graves of here. These are the graves of my ancestors. These are the graves of my ancestors from my father's side. And also to show you that when we went back in 1988, the people of Rutesheim made sure that they resurrected this cemetery, the Jewish cemetery, to make sure that it's not then showed that because in many areas the Nazis completely destroyed cemeteries of other from the Jews, and this goes back to my father, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather. For that, to see the graves, it was a very icky feeling to go back to there. Even though I never realized that the Jewish cemetery was completely segregated from the other cemetery. They were not together. They were actually in two different places. And when we went back in 1988, they also rebuilt the synagogue, which was semi-destroyed by the Nazis, and they were using it as a seminar place or and different things. Now, since then, I get a yearly magazine from the mayor of Rutesheim. What they have done with the synagogue, since there are no Jews living in the town, they have it's now a museum. It's actually a museum with a Jewish museum to show the people, to educate the people of our culture, because they feel that the Jews in preceding centuries brought a lot to that town, and they don't want to forget it. And because now you might want me to tell you about the 1988. I get a letter from the mayor of Rutesheim saying, we would like you to come to our celebration. We want you to come home, so to speak. We would like to meet you. And they didn't say that they want to come that you had to come with your spouse or whatever, but just it was for my sister and myself, because my parents were dead. And this woman that I showed you, who helped us get us the visa, she was my father's cousin. She was over 85 years old, but she went. They all invited her, and she was there with her grandchildren. And in fact, we were housed together in the same place. I hadn't seen her in about 20 years, and it was very nice, to get together and everything like that. And so at first, I had, through the years, when I first came to this country, I didn't want to let anybody know that I came from Germany. I didn't want to even remember the language. In fact, I try to forget the language. If people say where I come from, I'd say someplace in Europe, but I would never even, and I didn't ever want to go back to Germany. I didn't want to ever see it. Now, my sisters were different, because my older sister had friends who went to school with her, and they had been going back and forth, and friends had come to this country to visit them, and they invited us to come and visit them. So as it turned out, at first I didn't want to go. And certainly I didn't want to go without my husband, because my husband was ill, and I didn't know if I came back if I would find him, So I go back and forth. Then I found out that they would pay for my husband to come along, and my husband said, okay, he would try. He'd feel well enough, and he came with me. That was my husband's last trip, and I'm very happy that he was able to go on that trip. And so they paid for everything, for the airplane trip, and for one whole week they wined and dined us, put us in a hotel, took us on a bus around the surrounding area to other cities, showed us what's happened to the synagogues in other cities, and just have excursions and wonderful food and wonderful entertainment, continuous entertainment. Now, for 1 week, I didn't think it was worth to go to Europe for 1 week and come home, because such a big thing. And I thought, well, if we're going for 1 week, well, maybe we can afford to go for another week for ourselves. Well, as it turned out, these friends of my sisters, there were two friends who decided that they were going to, that for 1 week, they were going to entertain us. So we went first to Frankfurt, and one of them had, her daughter is a dentist. She told her daughter to move out of her flat for 1 week so that we could get we could be in that flat. And her daughter said, okay. She brought her own food. She cooked for us took us around, took us on the Rhine, and took us on every place, and treated us real nice. And then she took us to her sister in Landau, which is this one in Landau, where she also and then she took us after that. She took us to Rutesheim, to where we were supposed to meet. Huh?
Who was that a picture of?
What?
Who was that? Who were those people? You just
What,
held that
this?
up. This one. You just held that up. Are those?
Oh.
Are those?
So that is her. That is a friend. She went to school. Her name is Gertrude Brinkhaus, and she went to school with my older sister Gertrude. They were school friends, And now the interesting thing in Landau, I have my cousin, my father's first cousin. He lived with us for a while, but his parents stayed in Europe, and his sisters stayed in Europe, and they were killed. They were killed in concentration camp. And so when I was in Landau, I visited their house. This was their house in Landau, and which was now an apartment house and being leased out by other. And also, this was in Frankfurt. This was the lady, Beata, who was my sister's other friend, the sister in Frankfurt, who picked us up, and they're very, very friendly and very, very nice here in that apartment, and they dined us. So we had a complete free vacation, and then afterwards they took Gertrude Brinkhaus took us to Rutesheim to meet to Rutesheim, where we're supposed to be at the other. Here is that Gertrude Brinkhaus. Here she is again. See, we took pictures with them. We took pictures with them, and also what they did. Oh, okay. Now this is my cousin whose house I just showed you. He lived with us, and he was in the American Army, and he had he wears glasses and everything, but he was in he was a prisoner of war from the Americans. It was terrible. In other words, he was a prisoner of war while his parents were in Germany. And so they kept saying, well, aren't you from Germany? And he said, no, I've never been in Germany. I've never been, because he was thinking that, but somehow his parents perished, and his sister. And in Landau, in the Jewish community there, is a picture of his sister. That's my cousin's sister, the one who. And this is a picture in Landau, in the Jewish community. They showed you some of the people from Landau, and here's we found her picture found her picture. Okay, now also in Germany, in Rutesheim, people were absolutely overwhelmingly nice to us. These were two people who used to work for us. These people used to work for us when we were before the war, and they invited us to their home, and they had we had dinner with them and everything. So we took pictures, and everybody was very friendly. This was my house in Germany, where I used to go, where I remembered. I used to play. That was the yard and everything in my house. The mayor of Rutesheim took me to the house, showed me the house, and told me that and I did get that notification, within 1 year, they made a post office out of our house, a complete post office for the area, and people invited us for different tea parties, and it was a whole complete week. It's one thing after the other. It was really beautiful. I just want to see if I found that one picture I have of myself when I was when I was 5 years old, on my birthday. I had that picture, or maybe I don't know if it's in this. No, I guess I'm not as well organized as I should. It might be in there somewhere, but that's all right. I do have a picture in there of my 19th, when I was 5 years old, of a birthday party. You know, we have, we had that. Now, this was a very moving experience. This woman worked for us, and she was always very close to our family, and we always loved her, and she did everything she could until the very end, you know, until she was finally, they put her into a concentration camp because she was so nice to Jews, you know. So she came to visit us at in the hotel when we were there, and it was a very moving experience. You know, we all cried, and she remembered me when I was a little girl, that she had done things for me, and she had made some beautiful things that she gave us as presents, you know, and so that we remember her, and we write to her now, and that was her picture that I took of her, you know, in the town. So there were a lot of nice pictures. And here was one of the dinners that we had there. She is a priest. Her name is Ursula. Same name. I sat next to her, and there were a lot of different people in the town. That's me when I was because then we had lots of wonderful dinners. And you know what happened with the dinners was the people of the town came and brought the food to these places so that we would be able to, you know, have their food. And people stopped me in the street and asked me about my parents, where my parents were, you know, the real older people in their 80s, because that's what my parents would have been in their 80s, and what happened, and they wanted to know, you know, what happened and everything. And now, originally the town had 2,000 people. Now the town has 7,000 people. So you see what happened before the war. I was telling you, well, they did a lot of work. A lot of preparation was done through these small towns. They built factories nearby, and one thing what they have now is called Moby Dick. They have all over the town, there's the signs Moby Dick, and I says, what in the world is a German town doing with Moby Dick? And what it is the mayor, who is now still the mayor, he built this. A town of 7,000 inhabitants has all the recreation that we don't have in our town, in Pleasant Hill. I mean, fantastic. All the they have swimming pools and a great big place for sports, all kinds of sports. So in that place, there were 40 to 50 organizations that entertained us the whole week we were there. And they also had an ambulance following us. My husband was bitten by a bee, and within 1 minute, somebody came by and really took care of him to make sure that everything was all right. Because after all, there were 68 of us, and there were 2 people had heart attacks while we were there. See, I mean, they were already old, you know. Unfortunately, this is one of the things you might say, why did the town wait so long? Because the towns like Berlin and all these big towns had these things earlier. Well, they claim that to do this, each town was responsible themselves. They might have gotten some subsidy from the regular, but not too much. They had to raise the money themselves to get this, you know, because this generation wanted to say, hey, that wasn't us, what happened to you, and we want to tell you that. They took us to the schools, and as I brought this a tape, if you ever want a tape, a complete tape, showing exactly what happened. They talked to us, took us to the schools, and we talked to the young people, whom the young people said, why did you leave? I said, what do you mean, why did we leave? You threw us out. Your parents, your grandparents, not your parents, your grandparents, your regime, you know, they felt this way. And then, you know, this kind of discussions we had were really very meaningful. And my husband was very, very, very much touched by it because he comes from Poland. And I can only tell you this, that I went back to Poland with him twice, and we never could mention the word even Jew in Bialystok or in any of those places because they hardly looked at you with distaste. And so he said that he can't believe it that here in Germany that they would do something like that, and he felt that he was very pleased that he had come. And originally didn't want to come, and he made a big speech right at the end. I think it might be even in that speech, and somebody translated it to them and he was crying. My husband was crying, and everybody was crying. It was very, very, very emotional, situation, and it's crazy, but it made me feel like again, that I have a place that I could say I was born in that particular town, and I can be proud to say that at least that there were some people who still deserve that, And I plan possibly in the future time to take my grandchildren there, because my grandchildren are in England, and I will be in England in August, and I'll be going back and forth all the time, so that I will probably. We'll be going back to see them, maybe back to see these, because every holiday I get a card from the mayor, I get a newsletter, and anything happens in the town, I get people write to me and tell me what's been going on. So we have kept contact, So it's good to know that there's some positive things going on, because there aren't that many positive, because as I say, in the Eastern countries, there was none of that. None. Not in any of those countries that I went to where they felt you couldn't talk about, and I visited a lot of the Jewish places in those Eastern countries. That was quite a different situation.
What do you think about people moving back to Germany?
It would be very difficult for me to move back, for somebody like us, but somebody who's starting new and just wants to migrate to a country, it might, for young people, it might be okay. I'm not against it. I'm not saying that has to be a great exodus, but there is a place for them. There is a place for a Jewish community, and there is a Jewish community. I've met them in Frankfurt, Mannheim, Landau, and all those places where they have this small, but they're very happy. They seem to be, very happy. The synagogues are back intact. In some of the little towns, the synagogues were completely demolished, and the inhabitants of those towns took stone by stone and rebuilt them, just to prove that they are not, that this is not something that they had wanted to do, So so that I have, I myself would not want to go back. I mean, even with all this and all things that they've given me and all things that they've done, I think I'm glad we're again have some communications. But I don't think I would want to live there, that I would want to migrate. I mean, I've adopted the United States, and I wouldn't want to go anywhere else. That's where I feel. I feel this is my home, and I would want to, stay here.
You said, I believe there were 700 families that had lived in this town of 2000. You had mentioned that there were 700 Jewish families who lived in this house in this town,
Yes.
Rutesheim, of 2000. What do you know what has become of many of those people?
I have a little paper here which somebody wrote about our visit in 1988, and she mentions all this that a good many of them died in concentration camps, quite a good many. And there was also a great many of them who after all, who died because of age, because they were already in the 80s and 90s, of course, and they died. But and most of them are living in the different parts of the world. From the 68 people, 68 families that came to this to Rutesheim, you have to understand they were really only about 30 people who were really people who were born in Rutesheim. The rest of them were spouses, or like my father's cousin came with her grandchildren, you see, and so that so that there are not many actual people left, but there's a lot of people who still remember and who still, sort of the second generation or third generation, and by doing that, I think they created a lot of warmth and a lot of things. And they were, unfortunately, they had originally wanted almost 150 families, but that was such a large number that couldn't come because of health. And they didn't only come from the United States. They came. I should have brought the roster with me. I forgot that. They didn't only come from the United States. They came from Africa. They came from South America. They came from China. Somebody came. They came from all over the world. Of course, most of them did come from the United States, but they did come from all over the world. They were not, And there was one man who lives close to Rutesheim, and he lives in Alsace, which is very close by, and he's been the instigator of this whole thing. He sort of helped them along, helped them make the arrangements and stuff like that, and he's very close to Rutesheim. He visits a lot, and he has lots of friends there, and he's still sort of going back and forth. But his wife is dead, and he's all by himself, He's a Jewish man, yeah. He's in his 70s. He was in his 70s in 1988, so I don't know exactly what the situation, is now. But
And you said he helped arrange this gathering.
Yes, he did help. He made a lot of. Also, one of the things that I did, what made me do. Okay, they found out. They keep telling me what they're doing, and they said that the synagogue is a Jewish museum, and it also can be used as a synagogue if the Jews would live there. So they said that they're putting plaques of past Jewish families, and I sent them a considerable amount of money from the family, Bodenheimer family, because I wanted them. I thought that was very important because I wanted them. And then I told all my children and my grandchildren that if I never get back there with them, that if they ever get there, they should look that up and see that. Well, I'm a great believer in that because I even have a plaque in Pleasant Hill. We have a new thing from my husband. My husband was very active in the city of Pleasant Hill. When the new city center opens up, there'll be a little plaque there with his name on it too.
Do you know how the town found the people? How did the town find the people to come back to visit? How did they find you? How did they find you to invite you back?
When I came back, I tell you, it was just amazing. The first day I came back, I was standing on a street corner, and I was just there. I'll never forget that, and all these people come to me. Oh, you're little Ursula. They all remember me. I had a little curly hair. I was 3, 4, 5 years old, and some of them, and then people who were in school with me, there must have been about 10 or 15 people who came and said, "Don't you remember?" And I felt terrible because I really couldn't remember that. I couldn't even remember, but there was a lot of people who was overwhelmingly, friendly to me, and to my sisters have been there before. You see, they've visited back and forth, but I've never been back there before. And in fact, I've never had even the people. I'm sorry I didn't see them. Those 2 children that I used to play with, that Marion and Gertrude. My sister Gertrude went to visit them years later, but I've never gone to visit them. Some of them live in Canada, and she had gone to visit them in Canada, in fact. And because I've never, I didn't bother with all that because I felt very strongly like my husband did. I didn't want to have anything to do with anything German. I was just, to me, it was just, I just didn't want to see anything for a long time. And my sisters always thought that I was, why are you blaming everybody? But not that I'm blaming, I just didn't want to have anything to do with them. I wanted them, and especially when I thought of because of what happened to the Eastern Jews too. I mean, after all, it was the Germans that did the killing, whether a great many of the Germans, and the Poles too themselves. There were a lot of Poles instigated the killing and stuff, and that they're responsible for that. Hitler got his ideas from Poland, from the stories that my husband used to tell me of what happened in Poland. So, but I was treated very, very, very nice. And one thing happened. It was very funny. But there were 2 clothing stores in our town, and it was ours, and the other was not, of course, Jewish. And of course, when we left there, I'm sure it flourished because, there's only one town. Of course, now there are other stores. Well, I tell you, it was very interesting that those people made it their business to come and visit and entertain us and come to their house, come to their store, the older woman, the children, the grandchildren, and they also said that they missed the competition. So we used to have all that competition with you now. I said, but that was really good, when we really missed that, and we really missed you not being in the town, and all so that that all different people just contacted us. Another thing, if we went into a taxi, and we wanted to go from one place to another, the taxi drivers in Rutesheim wouldn't charge us. That week, everything, it seems like everybody in the town does their contribution to make you feel at home and to really be friendly with you, We went into we wanted to see our backyard. It was difficult to see our old backyard. And so some of the storekeepers took us through their house, their backyard, so we could look into their backyard, knowing that we were there and stuff like that. And it was just one thing after another. They were just the friendship, that they created, which was really beautiful. That I didn't think would be possible. Really, I didn't even think, but and when we left, I have a whole book at home of all the addresses, and they all wanted me to write, and we all would write. Now, the first year after I was there, I spent a fortune. I think the first Christmas, I sent, I don't know how many Christmas cards to all those people back and forth, but, it got to the point, after a while, it's difficult to keep, contacts like that. But I do get from the officials. They always send us, and the mayor. The mayor was, I tell you what, the mayor was about my age, and apparently when all this happened, he was terribly upset by the whole situation as a child, as what happened to his friends, to his mother's friends, to his whole thing. He could never really. It was very hard for him, and so he was very emotional, And when he made these speeches about how he felt, he was so friendly. And his wife had died about 2 months before we got to we got there. So the group, all the 68 of us, bought a beautiful something to put on his wife's grave, and that was terribly emotional, I tell you. So we all went. Everybody went there. And because it seems that I didn't realize it, but the Germans, what they've done is when somebody dies, they make a big thing out of it. They have their cemeteries. They've got big stories of the person's lives, and the whole big thing on it. We don't do that. We're not doing that kind of thing, So we bought this beautiful plant or something to put on his wife's, and he was so upset because his wife couldn't be here to meet us all because she meant a lot, and all that. And I tell you, the tears, he cried, we cried, everybody cried. It was just really very emotional. So this was very nice. And then some of those people, like I showed you, all these people were involved in that. All these were people in Germany. And this this woman, as I told you, was very close to us. She's not living in Rutesheim. She came from another town to visit us while we were there to make sure that she would get to, that we would get together with us and like that. So it was really very, it's, I don't know, some people say it's almost unbelievable that we would, turn around like that after all that's happened in the world like that. But that's what we need. We need to have a lot of friendships, and we need to have, need to do that kind of thing. And the people who are not responsible have to speak. It's the terrible thing. The whole thing is that Jews suffered so much, but they were people, these type of people like that, they suffered right along with us, because you see the Germans were very upset that they were so nice, and a lot of them, their husbands were in the Russian front. A lot of them never came back. They were put and some of the wives were even in detention because of their attitude and stuff like that. So you see, they suffered. It wasn't something that. They didn't have to do that. They could have just said, well, why should we, look what's going to make our wives bad and stuff like that, So,
what did you feel about, did you have any thoughts about older people? You had mentioned that you had a Nazi teacher.
What?
You had mentioned in your childhood,
Yes,
that you had a Nazi teacher.
yes.
And my question is that there were Nazis, there were ordinary civilian people who were Nazis. Did you have any thoughts about that when you
Yes,
saw
I'm glad you're bringing that up, because of course they were Nazis, because as I told you what happened from the time that young boy got killed, there were a lot of Nazi families that moved in. And originally it was 2,000 people, and I imagine the town grew as probably the war went on because of the factories, and there were Nazi groups. I think every small town probably had a whole bunch of Nazis move in, because the towns itself weren't that interested in having that many Nazis among themselves. I'm sure there were some, but they wanted to get more, and they wanted to make sure. In fact, they forced it upon them, And one thing that they tried to do was to try to make us feel that I remember one time just before, when I was still going to school, one morning I woke up and there was blood on all of our doors. They say, get out, Jew, or something like that. But and it isn't something that all the townspeople did. There were just the few of them, but they were very vehement, and they had a lot of support, physical support from these Nazi groups and stuff, and that were very strong there at that time. And so that's what they were trying to create, more hate. You see, they were trying to hate that and say, well, look, the Jews take away your this, and they've taken away your all kinds of, all the propaganda that comes with that. So that, and it said that one time they were told, you're not supposed to sell something to a Jew. If you're in a banker, you're not supposed to bank with a Jew. If you're in every phase of life, these were warnings. They had to do that. And I remember that one incident that was close to the Kristallnacht, when they had the blood on the door. I'll never forget that, And I didn't understand. It's as a child, my parents had to explain it, and I don't know if my parents, I could see that they were upset, but I didn't always understand what it all meant. I didn't have to understand. I'm seeing this through a childhood now. If you go through my mother's tapes, you see it through an adult. Maybe there are a lot of things that I might have probably missed, but this is just how I was affected by it, And I think my sisters were, I'm sure, just as affected as I was. But one thing it's done for me in my life, what has changed my whole life, by having this experience, that I'm always I've never quiet. I'm always fighting for truths and for the good of man, and always involved in all kinds of things like that. And I think that's what did it. I mean, that's what does to you when you have that kind of experience. So ever since I can remember, since I'm about 14 or 13, I've been involved in groups of some kind, in some kind of thing, you know, for some kind of fights, for always for some good cause, what I thought was a good cause, you know. And I worked very hard in many different situations where I do canvassing, and I would go, you know, try to educate, and I would try to, you know, I've always been, you know, somewhat involved in that kind of thing. And I try to install that in my children. I think I've pretty much succeeded, and most of my children are pretty much involved in that. Now, Judy is not at the moment because of her situation, but my other children, my daughter in England is very active right now in a lot of things, in peace and in environmental situations, and she's doing a lot of things like that in England. She says that in England, and my daughter in Portland has been on many peace marches and many other stuff like that, and done many things like that. And she still is just feels very strongly about a lot of those things. And that's something that comes from us. My husband was that way. We all felt that way. It was sort of our way of helping for a better world, you know.
Well, I wonder if we might go back to your childhood, and again, I'm interested in if you can try and remember your 1 year of schooling, and you said you only had 1 year of schooling.
What was that?
You said you had 1 year of schooling with a Nazi teacher.
Yes.
Were there other Jewish children in your class?
No, I was the only
You were
one
the
at the
only
time.
How were you ostracized? How did she specifically?
See, the other children were not. It was not as bad as the teacher. Well, she made all kinds of remarks, and I was always the last. She always put you the last one, and well, you know, it just felt that I mean, she was trying to try to get the other kids around, you know, to turn around. But the children were very nice. To see, the children were not bad. Even though I had lots of children that walked home from school with me and did things with me. But you see, they were being told, they were trying to teach the children, you can't be friends with this person. You can't do this. You can't do that. It was very hard for little children to understand that, you know. Because, you know, this was it was their thing. We didn't want to be involved in it. We had our own little world, the children, you know. And I didn't go through the whole year. As I say, as you see, I didn't finish the whole year because they claimed that I made that remark, that I said something like that. Maybe somebody maybe I said something in jest, or you never can tell what you say when you're a child, you know. And I did spend about 3 or 4 months at my grandparents' house in Edenkopen, and I enjoyed it there. In fact, it was very nice. It was very peaceful and very nice there. And my grandparents did migrate to Brazil. They finally did get to. It was very late, but by the time my uncle had to send a lot of money in from Brazil to get him out, you know. But it was their fault because they could have left earlier, but they were living a very nice life there in Edenkopen, and there was not very much discrimination there at that time at all. There was, you know, people were very, very nice, and in fact, my grandfather was, I think, he was. They tried to intern him, but the police chief was a good friend of theirs from the town, you know, and that they just make sure that nothing happened to them, you know, so that they, you know, left. It was So well, my grandmother had died before I was born. This was my second. He married another, but I never saw them again after that because they went to Brazil and we never got together, and that was that. They were in Brazil and we were in the United States. Even though my parents did visit Brazil at one time after the war, but they were already dead. I think my grandparents were still already dead at that time.
Do you know where they went in Brazil? What city in Brazil they went to? Where they went to in Brazil?
What?
Where did your grandparents go in Brazil? What city?
When did they go?
Where? What city in Brazil?
Oh, in Brazil?
Yes.
Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo, yeah. I have cousins in Sao Paulo. In fact, one of my cousins just died recently. And they had 3 daughters. One cousin had 3 daughters, and she died. And then I have another cousin who's still alive, and she has 2 children. And we don't really communicate too much, except when we do come. They came over quite often. They came to visit the United States, so we did see them, but we haven't been over there. None of us have been over to visit. I plan sometime, maybe in one of my visits, to go to Brazil sometime.
Okay.
You want me to instantaneously? Okay, let's see, about 5 seconds. I'd say anytime.
Gertrude received some ostracism as she was traveling to school. You said they gave her a hard time.
Your sister Gertrude?
Oh, when she went to
Work or school?
No, well, not Gertrude, because you see, Gertrude was actually she was living with a family in Frankfurt and studying, and so that she was just in one area in Frankfurt. And actually, because that was very helpful to us, by the way, I come back a little bit, is that she was living with a Jewish family, and she was also studying and with this family, and that was part of her education. And during the time when we were trying to get out of the country, it was Gertrude who helped my mother going through the towns, she knew, because she had lived with this family and she was out of the home, so she had some experiences, so she was helping my mother to how to contact people for getting funding. She was the one who helped us get that funding, get somebody to fund us so that we could go to the United States. She was with the connections that she had from the family that she stayed with before. But the one who had problem was Marion, was my middle sister, was that she traveled every day on the train. She traveled because there wasn't any school that she could attend to in Rutesheim, so she had to go. First she went to Speyer, and it got so bad in Speyer that she had to stop going there. It was just impossible because there was a lot of Nazi in Speyer, and so she went. She changed school after a period of time, and she told me just the other day that she changed to Karlsruhe, where I was born, and that's on the other side of the Rhine. That's about a half an hour away from where we were living, and it was a little bit better there, and she had a little bit better reactions, and I don't know what school she went to or anything like that. I couldn't tell you, except that she was still having trouble on the train, and there were people would see, oh, that Jew's on the train, what is she doing, stuff like that, So, but until almost till the very end, she was attending school. She was 13 years old, and the 13-year-old in Europe, the schooling is much, much higher than it is in the United States, because that's almost finished high school, almost up to college levels in some areas, So that's it. That's all I know about that, because since I wasn't there, I'd have to get that from her,
Did she look Jewish, or was she wearing an identifying something?
No.
How did they know?
In fact, the funny thing is, Marion has always been tending to romanticize about being Catholic. And she had many, many Catholic friends, and she was going, actually, now that you mention it, she must have been going to a Catholic school, because she had some of these sisters, even when we were in Rutesheim, who she visited and who visited her. She was very, very close to a lot of the Catholic family, and she always had planned that she would like to be a Catholic. So she never became one. She's in some other church now, but it isn't a Catholic church. It's something else. My sister Marion.
So how was she identified as a Jew then? On
Oh,
the train?
on the train, but she was still a Jew. I mean, even if she was going to a Catholic school and stuff like.
Did she wear a J, or did
No, we didn't. That it was too early. There was only later when you started wearing it. J. I don't think that everybody knew everybody. In those small towns, when you were on the train, it's not like you're in San Francisco or in a big city. You're on the train, you know where you come from. You're the Jew who comes from Rutesheim or something like that. That was pretty well established, and that's where she had, I wouldn't say it was really trouble, it was just harassment, that they had. But it wasn't to the point where she had to stop going. She still went, despite that, she still, for that matter, do you know that even I had harassment right here in this country, when I first came over here, in where we used to live in Washington Heights. They used to throw onions at me, I remember. I was a little girl, and there was some kids that said, "You dirty Jew," and stuff like that. So, anti-Semitism wasn't only in there. We've got plenty right over here, too. So, so that was, the problem. There was a lot of things going on. I mean, even here, that I had to contend with when we first came here. With in different groups, the different kids running around, depending on who their parents were. There are different parents from different situations. I worked in a nursery school in Harlem, and I had a child whose parents were absolute Nazis. They were it's unbelievable. But they taught that little child all kinds of things, and that little boy, he said some things that I just couldn't believe it. Finally, I had a meeting with the parents, and I said, you know that I'm Jewish. I said, and I don't know, maybe you don't know it. I said, but I don't like the things your little boy is saying, and I know he's not getting them from the blue, he's getting them from parents. And I had a discussion with them on that. And they were very much afraid that they were going to be thrown out of the nursery school. And they were very quiet, and they didn't say anything anymore, because they were saying things to the little 3-year-old, was saying all kinds of things, dirty Jew, or all kinds of black bastard, and things like that. All kinds of little kid was saying those things. So there's a lot, there's a lot we have to. We got right here too.
Were they immigrant parents, or were they American?
Yes, they were Americans. What happened was, in that situation, I worked in Harlem, and these were parents who at one time had lots of money, and they were very wealthy, and something happened. They lost all their money, and all of a sudden they were real poor, and they were just barely making it in a living. And they were lucky to get their child in the nursery school so that they could work in a decent place. So that they had to be careful, because otherwise they were going to go on. Because they just didn't have any. They were not on top anymore, where they could just do that kind of a thing, And this was right in the middle of Harlem, and 135th Street in New York City, in that area where I worked. But that was the trouble with that Marion had. That we all had. I mean, it was always troublesome until at the very end about the Jews. And Um, I think, but we had very little compared to what they had in the big cities or in the other parts of Germany. In some parts of Germany, where Nuremberg or some of those places where there were a lot of Nazis, the people, that was almost unbearable for people. You know, I think that we were very lucky that we didn't. You know, and that in relation to. I shouldn't bring it up in relation to what happened at the Eastern Jews. We really didn't. We were very lucky in many ways. Many of us, many people, many of us died, but many of us survived, and not that many survived in the Eastern Jews. So I feel. I mean, that's a fact. I mean, a fact like that. That. Do you want me to still talk about Germany or
Well, I personally have one more question.
Yes.
Relating to this part of your life.
Sure.
What was yours a religious life, and what was the quality of Jewish religious life?
Okay, we were fairly religious in this. We had one synagogue and everything related to the synagogue. We were a very religious family in Germany. We weren't outside of Germany, but we were in Germany. And I went to a religious school, and everything went around the Szakal went around the synagogue. You know, all of the social life and the whole. You know, a lot of different things were because there weren't that many people involved. It was a small town. You know, and that there were different different in the holidays. There was communal things like when it was Sukkot, you know, when we built those had built different people. And not everybody built one. That they had one of the one big one where all the kids went to and stuff like that, you know, and where we had a big you know, and it was somewhat conservative. I think it was between, you could say it was between conservative and not quite all the way, but just sort of in the middle, you know. That was the religious relationship in the town, you know. And as I say, like I said, my sister was interested in what was going on with the Catholics, and she was very friendly with the Catholic sisters. In fact, when we were visiting there in 1988, that sister was so funny. She was absolutely in love with my sister, and there was real love between the two of them. She remembered her. They gave each other presents. And there was this real old sister. She was already in her over 75 or something like that, you know. And she had, felt very close to my sister. It was a very moving experience with her, and a lot of the Catholic community, I think, even invited my sister, to come and visit with them, but she was friends with them. She was friends with a lot of them.
What do you think were the grounds for her attraction towards Catholicism? What do you think the grounds for her attraction toward Catholicism were?
Romantics. You know, the wearing the thing, and you know how the people my middle sister is very likes like romance, you know. That kind of interest at that time. Afterwards, she was only 13, 14 when, you know, she was a young woman at that time. And and I don't know if it was the religious part. It might be a lot of other things that were involved in it. It was just the uniform, and that they have the uniform, and some of their pictures and some of their replica stuff that they were doing. You know, that there was a lot of different things that could have attracted them.
Was there any Jewish training for you?
I think I probably had more Jewish training than they did. I don't know why, but I did because I wanted it. I was more inclined to be more interested in it. And we were not very religious in any way. We were not very religious, but we did go to temple, and we did go through the holidays and everything. Now, I don't remember that we had Christmas, that we did anything at Christmas in Germany, and maybe we did because I personally, even being fairly religious in some ways, after I started working, I got involved in Christmas and all that kind of stuff. So to this day, I have both. I have both Hanukkah and Christmas. I have a tree and I have the menorah standing next to it. I have that every year. And my daughter Judy's not very happy about that. You know, in fact, they don't want to come to my Christmas party. They come to my Hanukkah party, and we have two parties sometimes, you know. And so we always have a tendency to, you know, to be very manipulative, depending on where we were and everything. And when we came to this country, we didn't. No, we just. I think we went out, and I think my sisters completely left the religion. You know, when we came to this country, was because they've just had different lives, you know, and but my parents were still, you know, we still celebrated the holidays, but they didn't attend any temple or anything. We never joined a temple, and except I joined like youth groups. I went to some youth groups, and my husband did also a certain way, but we sort of had our own. We sort of had our own religious services and stuff. Did our own thing, you know. And my husband was really upset about it later on, and he thought we should have been more. We should have given them more instructions, but we didn't. You know, I mean, you can say that now, but we didn't. We didn't, you know, force anything upon them. And the only one of my children is my daughter Judy. The others are not at all, you know, completely away from it, from their religion at all, you know. They're not married to Jews, and it's neither with my two sisters. They didn't marry Jews, you know, and because my sister Marion married a black man, so that was another situation. So that she's into another thing altogether. So she's very close to the black groups and you know, and stuff like that. So for her, it's already another. That's another situation, you know.
I'm curious, do you think there was do you think any of this had to do with anti-Semitism within the minds of Jews themselves?
Oh, yes, yeah. Well, then of course, what I had to attend, what I always had to contend with was the difference between the East and the West. That kind of you know, not anti-Semitism, but it was sort of a friction in the family about families where you have something. And since my husband and I sort of dared to venture to change all that, to you know, that he was from the East and I was from the West, we didn't care anything about that. I mean, he and I didn't really think that much about that. But our parents, my parents and his parents, boy, when they were together, it wasn't very good. You could see the friction, and they never really became close or friends or anything like that, you know, because there was just too much on both sides, so to speak, you know.
How did your parents feel about your sisters marrying non-Jews? Did your parents say anything about your sisters marrying people who weren't Jewish?
I think that at first they were very upset, my parents, in the beginning, but I think after a while, they had so many shocks. Because first my sister married first she had a child, and then there were so many different things that they had to get over. That by that time they didn't mind them. They didn't mind at all. They would have liked them married Jews. So I guess I was their baby, and they were very happy with me because I did everything right. They felt I did it what they wanted, what they really wanted to do. So that always made them very happy. And I had a wonderful relationship with my parents. I can understand when people have frictions with their children or have frictions with their parents, and because I never had that problem with my parents, really. And I think even my children feel that way about their grandparents, about my grandparents, because they were just really wonderful. I think that they were just really, because when you think of what happened, what changes they've gone through. I talked about it with my father once. After all, when he was a young man, there wasn't even a radio. There wasn't even cars weren't even started, And here they went from all this to this kind of society. What are the changes that had to take place? And then besides, they had all the social changes. Here, we had to move from one country to another country, and then their daughter marries a black man, which is something that in Germany that would have been unheard of. That this is just something so unbelievable. It's that the whole idea of it blows their mind when they came through all these different things. So my mother was always modern. She always was ahead of her time, and I think she always that was very helpful in getting us, And then we had my sister Gertrude had some friends whose parents are many Jewish parents. They just threw their children out if they didn't marry Jews. They disowned them. They said that they don't have any more children. Their children are dead. There are many people, very religious people, who felt that way. Then my parents, we never had that problem. So they always accepted accepted everybody. And my they accepted my sister's children, and they accepted no matter no matter who you married or who you went with, it didn't matter. It didn't matter, but that was a real education. I think we educated them, sort of re-educated them, But always, you have to remember, it still has something to do with where we came from and the experiences that we have. What happens when you're against something, and you're against some race, or you're against some religion, and look what it could come to. And I think if you always have that in the back of your mind, that's what helps you to go on, to say, look, it's not right. You can't live that way. You have to overcome that, Do you want to...
Do you want to talk about your parents' tape?
My what?
Your parents' tape.
My parents' tape?
The interview tape.
The tape,
Tell
yeah.
us about that interview that you listened to yesterday, who it was by, and what
Oh, okay.
it was about.
Okay.
And your reaction.
My nephew, my older sister's child, Michael, went through school, and he had a very progressive education. He went to a college, I think, and that they always allowed him to do a lot of the different experiments and different things. And one of the things he decided to do was get the life story of his grandparents. And I think that he did a very, very formidable job, because there were 5 tapes, and he started out with their experiences in World War I. How my father was a soldier in the army in World War I, and my mother was how my mother was in one of those was this like a school, you know, for a finishing school for young ladies and something. And she met, this woman I told you before, the one who got us the money from the cousin, the first cousin that got the money for us to get to the United States. She was in that same finishing school with my mother. That's how it started, you see. And so she brought my mother home. She brought home to her house in Rutesheim, and that's how my mother met my father. That's how it started. See, that's how my mother met my father. And he had already had one eye, and he had already been through the war and all that. And you know, after a while they dated, and they decided, you know, to get married. That's how the whole thing started, you know. And this whole period of during that time in World War I, and then I think some of the tapes I've got to listen to is there's one about my mother's younger brother, and he's the one who migrated to Brazil, and there's a whole big tape on him, and I have to read that one myself. And it seems like during the whole time of these tapes, really surprised me, is that my father hardly says anything. He just says, "Oh yes," or something like that. And my nephew only says, doesn't ask any questions. That my mother just talks throughout the whole thing. She just continually rattles along the story, and she seems to have everything really clear in her mind, exactly where they were and what they were doing and all that, which I think was really fantastic, you know. And so that was the, I don't know exactly everything that's in those tapes for World War I, but I think it covers the period of my uncle and their courting and everything like that. And then there's a tape which covers the period of their courting and what they went back and forth. And during that time, my mother lost her mother. My grandmother died of tuberculosis. I think just shortly after my mother got married to my father. That was way back, quite a way back, yeah. And so, you know, during that period, you know what, there was nothing to be done for somebody with TB. You just rested, or you didn't have any, there was no medications, no nothing, so you just died. And so that was the tape talks about that, and then talks about how their married life and what they did in their married life, and how the children were born. First, my sister Gertrude was born, and apparently they had lots more money because that was before the 29. And my father had the whole factory, and they had, so that they were living a pretty good, you know, life and everything like that. And then, of course, my sister was born, and then, of course, lately when I was born. And I understand also that there was somebody supposedly almost born behind me, but my mother had an abortion, or she had something because she didn't want to have any more children during Hitler's time. That was one of the things they realized. Big times were getting bad, and they didn't want to have. So I understand that was a part of it too. And so there are two tapes that deal with the three of us being born in our lives and the whole big thing. Now the only one that I heard like yesterday. See, I don't remember all the others. Maybe I looked at them, but I didn't really, not so thorough. Which I did this one. I just donated to the archives here. It covers the period from the 1933 to the period that we just talked about in Germany, and what's happened in Germany, and this whole thing that I've just discussed it. And it covers it not from a child's point of view like mine, but from an adult's point of view. My mother talks about all these different incidents about her, getting my father out of prison and getting the money and going to different places and all, going through the whole process, and up to the time till we get to America. That's what that tape, So that covers the five. That covers the 5 tapes.
Do you know when your mother's brother, when he went to Brazil, why he went to Brazil?
Okay, he was living in Berlin, and he wasn't too happy there. He was in business in Berlin, and he was a young man, he was an adventurous man, a darling man. I loved him. He was really nice. And he felt that there was just like here, and the people went to the West. He just felt like there was something opening up for him in there also, because of what was going on with the Nazis and everything in Berlin. I'm sure they felt it there much earlier, the whole situation much earlier than we did in that little town. So therefore, he could see it earlier, probably, because he was after my parents earlier to migrate to Brazil. He was already talking about it. So apparently he was, he realized that. And that's one of the reasons he went there. And Brazil was quite open during those first periods, and apparently he was able to get settled and he had a family and really established. He had the children's clothing factories, and he did very well with them, very well, beautiful. Well, my children were small. I had the most beautiful dresses for them, just gorgeous little dresses that they made with the little, but they didn't have it in the rest of the world, but that he brought into the United States, where they had these little skirts, and they had panties right under it attached, and all that little dresses. And I'd have these 3 girls all dressed up in different, all dressed. Oh, it was beautiful. I tried to save them, and I don't know what happened to them. I'm very unhappy because I only have 1 granddaughter, but I'm hoping someday to have another one. And because my youngest daughter is thinking of is still very young, and she can, even though she has old grandchildren, she has old children, but she's only 31, 32 years old, and I think she might very well, they might very well, be pregnant. She might become pregnant, and so that I was hoping, but I can't find them anymore. Anyhow, so that's one of the reasons he went there, and he did quite well, and he established himself quite well, and until much later time when things got really bad in Brazil. See, now after World War II, Brazil's had some really bad times now, and he died about 8 years ago. But still, things were not too good. Just around the time that he died, he had to give up everything, and he gave it all up to his children, and his children didn't agree with him. There was a lot of squabbling and stuff, going on. But those early years he had very good, and he brought his own father and stepmother to Brazil, and helped. They lived very well. They all lived very well. They had a place in the country and a place in the city and all that kind of stuff, and then they'd.
Do you know what year he went to Brazil? About what year he went to Brazil? What year he went to Brazil?
What years? I don't know that. See, as being a child and during all those times, it's very hard for me to find that out. But I'm sure my sisters would know. And if I and probably the tapes will tell you that. The tapes, the tape. There was a tape about him. I'm sure that will probably, I just haven't had time to, to look at that tape or anything like that. So,
What became of your father's family? Did you speak of them? Your father's family.
My father's family.
Parents.
Well, okay, they died very early. My father's mother died when he was a soldier in World War I. He died just around. He died before. In fact, before he couldn't even get leave for something, and she was dead when. So I never met them. And his father lived until 19. 29. He died 1 year before I was born. And I showed you his grave. I had one of those, so I never did get to meet them. And I don't think my sisters must have probably just seen the grandfather, but they never saw the grandmother either. They never, had to see the grandmother. So that's, okay, my father had another brother. I'll tell you that story. Okay, my father had one brother, and he was in the war, and he had also some terrible things from the war. He had a shrapnel right near his brain, and in World War I, they did not operate or anything like they do today, or even World War II or anything. So it was okay unless if it hit him sometimes, he would have almost like an epileptic fit, But it wasn't epileptic. It was just something that he would just, he had to live with that. And so he was married, and he had 2 sons, and he came to the United States. And he lived in Washington Heights, in the area where we lived, but he couldn't work. He could never work because he never know when that would hit him. Okay, so during the period when my father had already gotten a job, and everybody was working, and his wife was working, he would take care of me and my cousin. My cousin was about 2 years younger than me, and he would a boy, and he would take us to school and pick us up, and he would make us lunch, and he was a wonderful man. He was really nice. At one time he took us, I remember he had such a good heart. He took us to the circus, and I still have the ticket. He took us to Barnum and Bailey Circus, and I remember he couldn't get a ticket for himself. Maybe he didn't have the money, or maybe he couldn't get the ticket. I don't know what the situation was. But he put us right in front to see the whole thing, and he waited for us outside. And in intermission, he would come in and bring us things to eat and stuff like that. I mean, things like that. He was just a really sweet, sweet, sweet man. I was just unfortunate that he had, and he was not very happily married, apparently, because his wife didn't like the idea that had to go to work. They didn't like, they didn't have that kind of life in Europe, and they have to come here and do all that. And when I was 14, I was away in the country. It was with friends of the family. I was July 4th, and what he did, he went up to Fort Tryon Park in New York City, and he threw himself off. Killed himself because he just couldn't. It was really, you'd say it was something from World War I that he was really, he just couldn't take it anymore. He just couldn't handle it anymore. It was just too much for him because there was nothing was helping him. He would get these fits, and then that wouldn't stop, and then he couldn't, it was just too much. And apparently he was not happily married, and I'll never forget that. I was very close to him, and I was away when I came back, and they told me this, and I was really upset for months that, when that happened to him. And that was my father's only brother. This is only, he didn't have anybody else, But my father was a very, I was very close. He was a very nice man. I mean, he was very much German. He was really very much assimilated into the culture of Germany. And if you just to look at him, you could see that he was really very much. We're not talking about pictures now. It's down here. That's right. That's just looking at him right now. Yeah. Yeah. That's in his younger days. And he liked cigars. He liked smoking cigars. And so did my husband, so I always used to have to sit between the two of them smoking cigars. It was just awful. but they really did enjoy, and so he was involved in that cigar making years before, so he knew what was a good cigar, and he would teach my husband what was a good cigar. They would go ahead and have their cigars, And, it's
Did
very
your
nice.
did your father's brother come to New York at the same time you did?
I'm trying to remember if they came earlier or later. I think they might have come a little earlier, because they had, they had some backing. He had some backing of relatives were there, so he got a visa, a higher visa, because he had some big people that were behind him and stuff like that, and that's how they came before we did. And his two sons did very well too. My cousin, my one cousin, he was something in Columbia University. He was very well known. He did a lot of research and teaching, and was very well careful. He died very young. He was only 50 years old when he died, my cousin. But his brother, my other cousin, we've lost contact with him. I've tried to call. I've tried to get in touch with him. I don't know what happened to him. He just sort of disappeared out of the... He's still alive, I think. His mother died. I know his mother died, but I just, somehow things just, when you go from New York to here, we sort of lose contact with people, Even though I did try to visit him when I was there, but in New York, but I couldn't find him. But, so I don't know exactly when they came. So it's like my mother's relatives. My mother had two sisters. One sister in New York, and she had and then a brother in Brazil, and then she had a sister. The only one who's still living from all of them is an aunt of mine who's living in New Orleans. She's in her late 80s, and I hear from. She used to come and visit us often, but lately she hasn't been able to, come and visit too much. But so we'll hear from them, sometimes. But
Did they leave at the same time? Your mother's two sisters. Do you know when they left Germany? Do you remember that?
me?
Do you know when your aunts left Germany also?
My aunts.
When they left?
Okay. One of the aunts in New York, who came to New York, left fairly early in the 20s. And then the one in New Orleans also left fairly early, because she had some very, very rich relatives on her husband's side who asked them to come and wanted her husband to work with them in New Orleans, so that they all came fairly early. They all came earlier, and they were from different parts of the of Germany. They didn't. One came from Neustadt. I think Neustadt was my Aunt Hilda, and